In our last meeting, we finished with the descendants of Keturah, one of Abraham's concubines, and we have seen how tribal confederations were formed, and together with Ishmael, they made up the various Arab peoples we know. Today I speak of tribal confederations because, unlike the Israelites, who tended to remain closely identified with their respective tribes, such as Reuben, Simeon, Ephraim, Judah, Benjamin, and so on, the sons of Keturah soon separated from their tribes and had to unite to maintain their influence. In fact, most of the names of Keturah's sons have been lost to history, and we cannot trace their paths. The only tribe that does have biblical relevance is that of Midian. We are told that this tribe lived in the westernmost part of the Arabian Peninsula, with the Gulf of Aqaba as one of its boundaries. This is exactly the same Midian to which Moses, I don't know if you remember, fled after killing that Egyptian soldier when he escaped from Egypt. It's exactly the same Midian where he finds a wife and settles down, living there for 40 years. In the verses that we are going to see later on, Ishmael will appear on the scene. And it can be said that this was the dispossessed firstborn of Abraham and the Egyptian servant Hagar. Let's remember that Ishmael was a teenager when Isaac was born. Let's also remember that until Sarah, Abraham's only legitimate wife, gives birth to Isaac, Abraham had declared Ishmael as his firstborn. For Abraham, Ishmael was the son of the promise, the son who would continue the covenant that God had made with him. It's no coincidence that the verse before this section about Ishmael's genealogy spells it out clearly in verse 11, which says exactly the following. It says, after the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac. This reminded us that God had not counted Ishmael as the son of the promise, and that the son of the promise was the one whom God himself caused to be born in a miraculous way through the dead womb of Sarah. And from the dead seed of Abraham, the son of the promise was Isaac. Let's read Genesis chapter 25, verses 12 through 18. It says the following. These are the descendants of Ishmael, son of Abraham, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to him. These then are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in the order of their birth. The firstborn of Ishmael, Nebaioth. Then Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Dumah, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their camps, 12 princes according to their families. And these were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And Ishmael breathed his last. And he died and was gathered to his people. And they dwelt from Havilah to Shur, which is before Egypt as you go toward Assyria. And he died in the presence of all his brothers. Let's review a little about Ishmael. And let's get a little more context. Because in today's study, we're going to talk a little about Islam. Okay? So before we examine, or before examining these, the sons of Ishmael, who formed the core of the modern Arab peoples, let me point out something important. Ishmael was a Semite, just like Isaac, and of course Abraham. What is a Semite? We might ask ourselves this question. A Semite is a descendant of Shem, son of Noah. Actually, the word Semite is a mistake in itself, at least in terms of its pronunciation and spelling. The word should be Shemite, not Senite. Okay? And this is due to the term used in the Hebrew language. That is, in any case, since Isaac and Ishmael had the same father, and he was a descendant of Shem, both of the sons, they are Semites. In fact, all the children of Abraham, they are Semites. I want you to follow me up to this point. Because by understanding this, we realize that Arabs and Jews are closely related since both are Semites. This is what makes the term anti-Semite, which we hear so much about today, and it's something perhaps interesting to know that anti-Semite is technically a term that means against the Semites, against the descendants of Shem. I have explained this in some courses. But, nevertheless, the way this term has always been used is to accuse people of intolerance toward the Jewish people. Now, it's quite curious that the Arab peoples, who are often also accused of promoting anti-Semitism, are themselves of Semitic lineage. Now let me clarify something, and something that is very important. The fact that God did not consider Ishmael, we could say, as the son of the promise. It does not mean that Ishmael was cursed by God. It's very important to understand this. Ishmael was neither punished nor judged. He simply couldn't be the son of the promise because God had determined that someone else would be. That's all. And that would be Isaac. In fact, to somewhat compensate for the fact that Ishmael was stripped of his status as firstborn, which he held until Isaac was born, he was given a physical inheritance almost exactly the same as Isaac's. Isaac, the difference is that while Abraham would provide Isaac's wealth and prosperity, God would provide Ishmael's. Wonderful. In our time, although the Arab peoples are generally enemies of Israel, this is something we need to understand. They are by no means an accursed people. The Arabs have been and will continue to be severely corrected by God for having rebelled against his consecrated people. Let's look at it this way. Just as many who still do not want to open their minds and refuse to yield will continue to be corrected by God. Is it for forgetting Israel or for seeking anti-biblical ideas or what? They are thinking all the time, trying to figure out what to do about, for example, the issue of Israel's territory. Remember something, in our last study I mentioned that the descendants of Ishmael, together with the descendants of Keturah, make up the current Arab peoples. Remember that we talked about this. In fact, at one point I talked about Qatar, but many of those who are watching this video today are not, and understand this, they are not of a pure lineage. What can be said is that probably many of you have some mix. You see, nowadays it's very common to get those kinds of DNA tests done. So possibly many of you have European, Asian, or some other kind of ancestry. And the same thing happens with Arab peoples. They, descendants of Ishmael and Keturah, began to mix, but very quickly. Therefore, in the book of Isaiah, in chapter 60, we will find the mention of Midian, Ephah, and Sheba. These were tribes of Keturah, along with Kedar and Nebaioth, sons of Ishmael. For some good context, how about we read together? Turn there quickly. Turn to the book of Isaiah, or at least write it down, chapter 60. We are going to read verses 1 to 7. It says, "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of Jehovah has risen upon you. For behold, that darkness will cover the earth, and thick darkness the nations. But the Lord will arise over you, and his glory will be seen upon you. Nations will walk by your light, and kings by the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see, they have all gathered together. They came to you, they will come from afar, they will be carried in arms, and then you will see and shine. Your heart will marvel and expand, because the multitude of the sea has turned to you, and the wealth of the nations has come to you. The multitude of camels will cover you, dromedaries from Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba will come. They will bring gold and incense, and they will proclaim the praises of Jehovah. All the flocks of Kedar will be gathered for you. Rams from Nebaioth will serve you and be accepted on my altar, and I will glorify the house of my glory." This is something very, very, very important. Interesting, because it is an end times prophecy about what has been happening and continues to happen today with Israel. For the most part, many of these events are beginning to happen before our eyes, such as the return of the Jewish people to the land of their ancestors. And of course, the return is an ongoing process that has been happening over the past few decades. In the last verses of what we just read, we see the names of those 5 tribes. The Arab tribes, Midian, Ephah, Sheba, Kedar, and Nebaioth. Names that we also read in Genesis. To summarize this part of Isaiah, the Arab peoples, and listen to me very carefully, will eventually become friends and servants of Israel. And they will bring them wealth and prosperity. Now, let me be a little more specific. It's about the Arab peoples coming to worship the Messiah in Israel. Now, this is not for the immediate present. This is for a future time, but it's for the very near future, where we will see multitudes of Arabs bowing before the Hebrew Messiah from the lineage of David. Therefore, I want to take the liberty here to advise all believers in Jesus to be very careful in how you see the Arab peoples and how you treat them. It's true that nowadays most Arabs are mistaken on the issue of Israel, and they've even chosen to abandon the God of their ancestors. And listen carefully, this was the God of Abraham, and they abandoned him to adopt a false god, or rather a non-god called Allah. They have chosen to be avowed enemies of Christians and Jews. And unfortunately, there is a fact that is reported so falsely in today's media. And in fact, even in some of the churches that today are trying to be more tolerant. But the truth and what must be clear is that the God of Abraham is not the God of the Arabs today, as they claim. And many also end up claiming this. But as you well know, it is also true that there are many Arabs who believe in the Messiah, the so-called Arab Christians. I remember a few months ago we were at the congregation at a service and I had just finished performing baptisms. Suddenly, when I saw that everything was over, I asked the question, "Is there anyone who wants to enter the waters?" And over there, a woman stands up, raises her hand high, and happily, she says, "Me, please, I want to be baptized." And she had a big smile on her very dark face. She was Arab and made the decision to follow Yeshua as her savior and embrace the God of her ancestors. Today in Israel, there are many Arab Christians. In fact, there are more Arab Christians than Messianic Jews. And listen carefully, because Arab Muslims believe in Allah. Those who believe in Allah are no more deceived than many people we know today. Think of family, friends, and neighbors who are under the deception of not believing in anything at all, because that is also being deceived. On the other hand, although as believers, we must be knowledgeable about supporting Israel, even knowing that this may put many of you in complicated situations, it simply must be done because it is something that God demands. And it is something that we are called to do before God. But listen to me carefully, because the fact that you support Israel should not mean that you must hate the Arabs, nor the Muslims either. We could use the term hate or abhor the belief that they hold. We may not agree with what they do, but we cannot cast them aside or deny them the possibility of salvation. And you know what? We are already on this path. This is where I start talking about this, and it's a good time to mention a couple of things about Islam. For example, we've always heard that Islam says that Ishmael is the true founder of Islam. I think it's really important to be able to dedicate a little bit of time to this topic because of the terrible ignorance and the lies that exist on this topic, driven by certain particular interests. About the simple history of Islam and Ishmael, allow me to clarify this. I'm going to tell you once and for all, Ishmael is not the father of Islam. He isn't, period. He's not even the father of all Arab peoples. He is a father, yes, but only to some of them. Let's look at this. Isaac and Ishmael represent the crucial point of the issue between Jews and Christians on one side and Muslims on the other. To put it one way, Isaac and Ishmael are like a kind of decisive fork in the road. Now then, understand me clearly on this. The differences between the Judeo-Christian world and the Islamic world are irreconcilable. There is no middle ground. There is nothing in common, even if they try to disguise it. It doesn't exist. It's that simple. I'll give you a few points to help you understand what I mean. Islam claims that the words of God, of Allah, and of the people of the promise of the covenants with Abraham descend through Ishmael, and they claim that this is recorded in the Quran. Of course, Jews and Christians hold that the promise of the covenants descends through Isaac. And this is recorded in the Bible, which I remind you is the Word of God. A moment ago, we were able to read some chapters that explicitly state that the promised son in the covenant line came through Isaac and not Ishmael. Interestingly, Muslims acknowledge that this is what the Bible says. And they claim that the biblical texts have been corrupted and altered by Jews and Christians. Listen carefully. In fact, according to that view, the Bible should say that it was Isaac who was rejected and that Ishmael was the true son of the promise. That's what that view says. Therefore, that makes it a somewhat disastrous belief. And I'm going to explain it. Because I'm going to try to do it in a simple way. First, the religion of Islam didn't even exist until the Prophet Muhammad founded it. Muslims totally agree with what I just said. That means Muhammad wasn't even born until almost 600 years after the time of Jesus. For example, as a matter of history, the last book of the Old Testament was written 1,000 years before the birth of Muhammad. The last book of the New Testament was written 5 centuries before the birth of Muhammad. Let me explain it to you or illustrate it in another way. The Old Testament as we know it was completed around 400 BC. And the New Testament as we know it was completed around the year 100 AD. And the founder of the religion of Islam was born around 570 AD. When reading the Bible, Muhammad, who was the founder of Islam, says, "Oh, all of this was corrupted by the Jews just to distort what I am telling you, which is the truth." Let's look at it this way. It would be as if someone today stood up and said the following. I'm going to use a fairly simple example, but I want to focus on something that everyone knows, a national constitution, in this case, that of the United States. And although it could be that of any other nation, let's imagine the following. A person comes and tells us, "Hey, listen. The American Constitution, that one, the one in Washington, the one under glass, the one that was written 200 years ago is not correct. And I wrote the correct one, the original one, the one under the glass in Washington, that one is corrupted. And they corrupted it precisely so you wouldn't believe that I wrote the correct one here in Jerusalem in the year 2026. Now then, tell me, isn't it utterly illogical and absurd to think that? Well, that's precisely what Islam claims about the Holy Scriptures nowadays. By the time Muhammad invented Islam, the Roman Catholic Church was already dominant in Europe and Asia. Constantine, who had declared the new Gentile way of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire, had already been dead for more than 200 years when Muhammad was born. It doesn't even matter that with the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the oldest original Hebrew biblical writings that exist. In fact, they date back to before the birth of Jesus and have been studied, published in photographs. And many of them are even on display today, for example, in different museums, also in the city of Jerusalem, so that everyone can see them and they can fully understand that the Bible we have before us is exactly the same as the one that was written there. That is to say, there is no mistake, not even a comma or an accent mark has been removed. This discovery is showing us that there was neither any corruption nor any alteration. However, Islam claims that what Genesis should have said is that Ishmael was the chosen one and Isaac the rejected one. On the other hand, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, there are 2 ways and only 2 ways to know who God is. Number 1, by his name, and number 2, by his attributes. There are scholars whom you may have heard about who say that Allah is simply the Arabic word for God. While in the linguistic sense, this makes some sense, since the only name of God in Islam is Allah. But pay attention, because they reject all the biblical names of God. Even when they are brought into their language, when they are Arabized, they translate them into their own language. For example, Shaddai, or any other biblical name or title for the God of the universe, is considered incorrect according to Islam. Therefore, the conclusion is that the God of Islam has a completely different name from the God of the Bible. As for attributes, the God of Islam glorifies death. The God of the Bible glorifies life. The God of Islam says that Muslims must win converts by means of the sword. The God of the Bible says that his believers must win converts through love and faith. On the other hand, the God of Islam says that the conduct of a Muslim determines his eternal future. The God of the Bible says that the condition of the heart determines one's eternal future. The God of Islam has no Messiah. The God of the Bible says that there must be a Messiah. The God of Islam is a God of war. The God of the Bible is a God of peace, and so on. The attributes, the character, and the instructions of the God of Islam as found in the Quran are exactly the opposite of the attributes, the character, and the instructions of the God of the Bible. However, today there are many leaders, believers, in fact, Christian religious people who tell you that Christians and Muslims worship the same God. I've heard some pastors say that the best way to approach a Muslim is to tell them that we respect that they worship God. They just don't know that the God they're worshiping is Jesus. I wonder, wait a minute, what did they just say? What do you mean they worship Jesus? This is wrong. This is a failure of the worst kind. This is what is being taught to God's people today. Or to believe that worshiping any god is fine, no matter their name, characteristic, or attribute, because any god is actually, according to many, the God of Israel. Now then, I have some bad news for all those who believe in this theory. The answer is, it's not the same. Allah is not the God of Israel. The God of Israel has been telling us that if we love people, we must warn them and tell them the truth. Our people are a people with a history of mistakes. They have been written down. We have them there in the Bible so that we can learn not to make the same mistakes. And in the Bible, we have examples of what happened to the Israelites when they worshipped both Jehovah, the God of Israel, and the gods of other nations. Those who also tried to be politically correct and tolerant according to the standards of that time. Or, for example, those who declared that Elohim, the God of Israel, and Baal were the same, that they were one. All of those were scattered and millions perished. Now there is no difference between what they did and what is being done today. Today, when it is declared that Jehovah, the Messiah, and Allah are the same, the result can be the same. That is, the consequence can be the same. Let me remind you of something. God did not deal with them individually, nor did he separate them family by family. God imposed judgment on them at a national level, and the same is prophesied for our time. When the Bible teaches us to pray for those in authority, it's because every decision they make will affect a nation. And as a consequence, the inhabitants of that nation are also affected. Therefore, there is no doubt that if something goes wrong, even believers can end up being affected as well. It doesn't mean that we are exempt from suffering in that same nation when the whole nation is destroyed. That is to say, we can fall under God's discipline. Of course, because we trust God, we understand and know that our eternal future is in God's hands, that our salvation is in Him. But anyway, let's move on to another topic and take a look at the tribes of Ishmael. Nebaioth was the firstborn of Ishmael. His tribe is known as the Nabayati. and they appear in the Assyrian accounts about the battles of their empire against the peoples of the Arabian Peninsula shortly before Judah was taken captive to Babylon. We talked a little about this in the past as well. Now, we know this people better today as the Nabateans, and even more commonly known in our time as the Jordanians of Petra. Kedar is mentioned many centuries after Genesis in the Bible, and they formed some kind of association with the Edomite people, the descendants of Esau. Remember, we also talked about this. These were people who wandered as shepherds and goat herders across the Arabian and Sinai peninsulas. Without a doubt, they make up at least a part of today's Bedouins. Adbeel is known in the Assyrian historical records as Ibidahil. They were conquered by Tiglath-Pileser, who played a fundamental role in the conquest of the northern kingdom of Ephraim and Israel. And they were sent to guard the Egyptian-Assyrian border. The tribe of Duma appears again in the book of Isaiah in chapter 21. And it says that they occupied a territory just north of Midian along the Gulf of Aqaba in the Arabian Peninsula. Naphish appears in the chapter. They seem to have merged into a single tribe, rather. And later in the Bible, they are in the book of 1 Chronicles in chapter 5, and they are described as the Hagrites, a contraction of Hagar with the suffix itas, who descend from Hagar. In practice, not much more is known beyond mere speculation, we could say, about the remaining 12 sons of Ishmael. So I prefer not to go deeper into this since we have no basis. In verse 16, we are told that the descendants of Ishmael lived in villages. That is, they did not build or live in walled cities. They were country people, farmers, and shepherds. And some were desert nomads. They were also merchants. This explains the lifestyle that the Arabs developed, in which, because they lived in villages without family or fortifications, they constantly attacked each other. In other words, they were constantly attacking each other, hoping to gain benefits for themselves by taking advantage of others. Now, it should be noted that this mentality still persists to this day. Part of what fundamentalist Islam fights against is a lifestyle that produces goods rather than their traditional practice of taking what others have produced. Arab tribal traditions revolved around this. They were always seeking to snatch wealth and power from other Arab tribes. Even Muhammad, the founder of Islam, earned his reputation as a leader by leading attacks by his own tribe against other Arab tribes, and always come out victorious. The goal was always the same, the loot. Now I want to reflect on this for a moment. Why? Those Arab Muslim strongholds in the world are also the most backward places in the entire world, like for example Afghanistan, Pakistan, most of Iraq and Iran. In fact, it's because, in general, people there have no concept of work, production, justice, or technological progress. When Islam attacked Europe around the year 711 AD, what they were after was European wealth, not the European lifestyle or European technology. They wanted to take what Europe had produced, and that's exactly what they want today. The war against terrorism is indeed a struggle for a way of life. But the way of life they want is, we produce it, they take it. Because they don't even know how, nor do they want to know how to produce and share. That's the sad reality. In verse 17, we're told that Ishmael lived 137 years, and then it says he was gathered to his people. Here again, we find a clear explanation of what it means to be gathered to his people. We talked about how he was gathered to his fathers. Where were his relatives? Who were his relatives? Was it about life after death? If so, what did it consist of? We will never know because in the Torah or in the Old Testament, there aren't too many details. Now, rather, this is just a polite way of saying that he lived a good life and died in peace. He probably died of natural causes. His people were undoubtedly his descendants, not his ancestors. He had been, let us remember, separated from his father, so he was the beginning of a new lineage. Being gathered to his relatives, I'm sure, refers to his immediate family, the ones who were closest by, which would not be known as Arab until several centuries later. Next, we are given a kind of general territorial boundary where the descendants of Ishmael lived, and it begins at the border of the Sinai Peninsula with Egypt. We are told that this is the reference to Shur, which means wall. And then it extends northward to the Assyrians in the Mesopotamian region. The exact location of Havilah is unknown, since there are many places in the Middle East with this name, or there are also variations of this same name. But it is inferred that the descendants of Ishmael tended to stay among themselves. That's why it is said that they camped next to their relatives. It's very similar to what happens with the Jewish people regarding the Sheba. They didn't separate. It seems that they didn't mix easily with the Mesopotamians, the Egyptians, the Nubians, or with many other non-Semitic peoples of the land. In general, the descendants of Ishmael occupied areas to the north, south, and east of the land of Canaan. Now then, we know that a little more now about Ishmael. And we're going to keep moving a little further in the book of Genesis. Let's read verse 19 and let's see. Let's read up to verse 34. If you have it there, it says this: "These are the descendants of Isaac, son of Abraham. Abraham begot Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean, as his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord heard him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is so, why am I like this?' And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord answered her, 'And there are 2 nations in your womb, and 2 peoples will be separated from within you. One nation will be stronger than the other nation, and the older will serve the younger.' When her days to give birth were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first one came out red and was covered with hair like a fur coat, and they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. Esau sells his birthright, and the boys grew up. Esau was skillful in hunting, a man of the field, but Jacob was a quiet man who stayed among the tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob cooked stew. And when Esau came back from the field, tired, he said to Jacob, 'I beg you, let me eat some of that red stew, for I am very tired.' Therefore he was called Edom. And Jacob replied, 'Sell me your birthright today.' Then Esau said, 'Behold, I am about to die. So what good is the birthright to me?' And Jacob said, 'Swear to me this day.' And he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and got up and left. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Chapter 25 is divided more or less as follows. The first third contains the last important details of Abraham's life. The second third mentions the descendants of Ishmael, and they provide information about where they settled. And here in this last part, in this last third of chapter 25, we begin to deal with the end of Isaac's story. And with his son Jacob, the legacy is being prepared to be passed on once again. Isaac is mentioned very rarely, compared to his son Jacob and his father Abraham, for example. At the end of chapter 24, we are told that Isaac married Rebekah, but then we are not given any information about the first 20 years of their marriage. For example, we know that unlike Abraham, Isaac seems to have stayed close to home and did not move around much. The well-known stories about Isaac are centered in the city of Beersheba. As far as we know, he did not live in Hebron either. And like his father, except perhaps near the end of his life, he owned many flocks and herds. In verse 21, for example, we find that, much like what happened to his father, Isaac also spent a long time with his beloved wife, who could not give him an heir. Also, saying that she was barren meant that she had not given Isaac any sons, not even daughters. Just like Abraham, Isaac comes before God, and he also grants the request for a son. Rebekah becomes pregnant. Although there are great similarities between the situation of Abraham and Sarah, paralleling the problem faced by Isaac and Rebekah, there are also great differences. For example, neither Isaac nor Rebekah were elderly, nor were they past childbearing age. What's more, we don't find Isaac with concubines, nor Rebekah offering a servant or slave to give birth in her place. Apparently, they had no plans to do anything other than accept the situation until God decided to intervene. Really? I'm just asking, did the Lord wait for Isaac to come to him before granting him children? Was the Lord somehow constrained by Isaac so that Isaac's prayers were necessary before God would make Rebekah fertile? Sometimes there are many who base their arguments, and there are many debates among spiritual leaders. And one of them is this: does God need our prayers to act? Now, the Bible does not give us evidence that it must be that way. But God does want to teach us. And He also wants a relationship with us. However, what kind of relationship with someone is possible without communication? While spoken language is the typical form of communication between humans, prayer is the way God ordained for communication between humans and God. And although God does not need prayer, He does desire it. On the contrary, we as humans need to pray. I can't think of a way that strengthens faith more than communicating to God our needs, our situations, what's happening. Like, for example, sharing and talking with Him about other people's situations. Now then, this pregnancy so longed for by Rebekah almost immediately became uncomfortable for her. And these twins, apparently so active inside her womb, led her to ask God what was happening inside her womb. Let's be clear about something. This pregnancy worried Rebekah. The activity inside her womb was not normal. An unusual Hebrew word is even used to uncover what is happening. The word that normally is translated as they struggled is vitrosetsu. This verb actually has more of a sense of crushing, pushing, destroying, something quite violent. That is, something complicated. And we've already talked about the account of Jacob's birth, who would become the first Israelite. Now, I want us to pause for a moment and I want to put something in perspective. And we're going to look at the evolution of the patriarchs. Abraham, Jacob's grandfather, was born a pagan. At the time of Abraham's birth, the world was made up of only one kind of people. The human race, aside from genealogical and social divisions, all human beings were practically the same in the eyes of God. The only exception was the lineage of Ham, one of the 3 sons of Noah, considered a cursed lineage. In the time of Abraham, there was no division among humanity. There was no people set apart. Once God called Abraham to leave his country and his family, this began the process of divine division. That's where the process begins of the world dividing into 2 groups, his people and everyone else. The name we give to God's people is the name we find in the Bible, and that is the Hebrew people. So when Abraham obeyed God and moved to the land of Canaan, through a declaration, God divided humanity into Hebrews on one side and everyone else on the other side. Abraham's decisions and a declaration from God were the only factors that made Abraham different, in God's eyes, from all other human beings. Isaac, son of Abraham, he represents the next step in the evolution of the Hebrew people. Isaac was the firstborn Hebrew. Abraham was Hebrew by a mere declaration, but Isaac was Hebrew by birth. However, then there was something that kept intervening, and it was God's declaration. Abraham had another son. Remember, his name was Ishmael, whom he considered his firstborn, and therefore the one who would continue God's covenants. In other words, for Abraham, Ishmael was what? Hebrew. But in the strictest sense, Ishmael was Hebrew until something changed. I know what I'm saying might be a little confusing. Let's see. Let's look at this. There came a time when the God of Israel said to Abraham, "Not so fast, Abraham, stop. Just as I separated you from your father and your brother, I will also separate Ishmael from his father and his brother." Ishmael was going to be separated from Abraham and Isaac. This means that Ishmael was not going to remain a Hebrew, but Isaac would. So this is where the key question comes in. If both Ishmael and Isaac had a Hebrew father, Abraham, how is it that only Isaac is considered Hebrew today? Why isn't Ishmael simply another branch of the Hebrews? Why don't we think of Ishmael and his descendants, whom we call Arabs, also as Hebrews? This is where a very important principle is established, one that every Jew and Gentile should pay very, very close attention to. So please, I want you to really pay full attention to me now and consider this as a permanent part of our memory. While all this about the birthright, genealogy, and physical lineage establishes a physical identity. Now then, physical identity is flesh and bone, and it is God's choice and declaration that establishes spiritual identity. Let's look at it this way. Your identity, or your physical identity, and your spiritual identity are 2 different things. Are you following me so far? Pay very, very close attention to me, because this is really important in order to understand the whole thread of this story. The Hebrew term comes to denote much more than just a simple physical identity. Hebrew also defined a spiritual identity. Let me explain it this way. Hebrew was meant to be a term that described a combination of physical and spiritual attributes of a person. Furthermore, the life of a Hebrew, both physically and spiritually speaking, was to be governed by a set of laws and promises that God had made with the first Hebrew, Abraham. In other words, the earthly life of a Hebrew was supposed to revolve around his spiritual life. And we call these laws and promises that define the whole life of a Hebrew the Abrahamic covenant, which would later be expanded and given to Moses, and which we now know as the Torah. So then, even though Isaac had the physical constitution and was suitable to be a Hebrew, it still required an act of God, that is, a divine choice for him to be declared a Hebrew. Now think about this. Ishmael also had the proper physical constitution to be a Hebrew, but God did not grant him the necessary spiritual status to make him one. Therefore, with the choice of Isaac and the rejection of Ishmael, we find ourselves at a huge crossroads. One path led to the Hebrews and another led away from them. As we begin to deal in Genesis 25 with the twin sons of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, we are going to see this process and these principles repeated once again. The question of who will be chosen as the heir to the covenant rights given to Abraham is the key point. In other words, between Jacob and Esau, God would declare one as his heir, who would be chosen to be Hebrew, and the other would not. Both Jacob and Esau, according to all physical evidence, were Hebrews by birth through their father Isaac. If we relied solely on the physical definition, it would seem that both were Hebrews, and in a certain sense they were, but not really. God, once again, through a declaration, would separate them. Let us remember that while we could observe some physical and genealogical differences between Isaac and Esau, after all, they had mothers of different nationalities, and they were also half-brothers. It was completely different in the case of Jacob and Esau because they had the same mother. And they also had the same father. Jacob and Esau were twins. Physically, genealogically, there was no difference between them. Their DNA was almost identical. So how is it that Jacob was chosen as a Hebrew and Esau was not? It was only by declaration. And that is God's sovereign decision. That's what the word election means. God chose Jacob over Esau. And Jacob would be Hebrew, while Esau is stripped of his right to be called Hebrew. And the only difference between Jacob and Esau was a spiritual difference. And this was caused purely by a declaration from God. So to help us better define what a Hebrew is, we can say that a Hebrew is someone who is a descendant. In the line of covenant promises given to Abraham, or in more biblical terms, a Hebrew is an heir to the covenant promises given to Abraham. If a human being is an heir to those promises, then he is part of God's set-apart people. So, according to God's covenants with Abraham, the world is divided into two groups, the Hebrews and the rest of humanity. Abraham is the one who establishes the line of the covenant promise, and according to God's statement, his father and his brother were excluded. Isaac, son of Abraham, continues the line of the covenant promise. And according to God's statement, his other son Ishmael is excluded. Jacob, son of Isaac, would continue the line of the covenant promise. And according to God's statement, his other son Esau would be excluded. But as we will see in a couple more chapters, from Jacob onward, all of Jacob's descendants would be called Hebrews, with no more exclusions and no more selection by divine declaration. From Jacob's descendants onward, one was Hebrew by law. If someone was physically born to a Hebrew, that person was Hebrew. And that's it. But even more, if someone was not born Hebrew, that is, a Gentile, and wanted to become part of the Hebrew people, it was possible for them through certain rules and laws established by God. And they could do it. Are you following me so far? I hope so, because this applies to many of you. Everything I've been explaining sets up the model of how a person becomes part of God's people. So the way one comes to be called part of the people, set apart by God, the Hebrews, who eventually came to be called Israelites. It happens through a series of branching points. It is sequential and begins with the branching from Abraham, then from Isaac, and then from Jacob. And it stays that way for about 1,800 years. 18 centuries after Jacob, we find a branching. It's called the New Covenant. And the New Covenant? It's a prophecy from the Old Testament about a time when these covenants and physical laws of the Hebrews, called the Torah, would be spiritually written in the hearts of certain men. Not in everyone's heart. Only in the hearts of those who were chosen and declared by God as his own. And the way this would happen would be through a Messiah, and this new fork brings us back to the starting point. And this is a new fork that we could say fulfills the promise of the Abrahamic covenant that all the families of the earth will be blessed in you.
Yeah, and T.
Abraham. All means Gentiles and not Jews. It doesn't mean that. It means Jews and not Gentiles. I mean, I'm not confusing you. All means all. Also, those who are included in the covenants of the Hebrews once again imply God's choice and declaration. And the key to all of this is the Messiah. So then, this story that we are about to analyze in the book of Genesis chapter 25, the story of division, choice, and separation, is crucial because of the God of Israel, and it has so many wonderful nuances and establishes so many messianic principles that unfortunately this is as far as we go because we are out of time. But we are going to end here. Next time we are going to get into one of the most crucial parts, I would say, because it will take us much deeper into the scriptures, and we are going to discover incredible things that we never imagined were written there for us. Thank you for joining me this far, and I want to encourage all those who want to go much deeper into the scriptures to visit the Land Academy. There you can access different exclusive materials that will help many of you, those who love the scriptures, to draw gold from within its pages. May God bless you. May you have an excellent rest of your Sunday, and may you have a great start to your week. See you next week as we continue with chapter 25, which we haven't finished yet in this wonderful book of Genesis. Shalom and blessings to each and every one of you.